Okay, I'm going to suggest that we make a start as we have lots of interesting things to talk about today. So hello everybody, and thank you for joining us for the second webinar in a 5-part series exploring the role that media policy can and perhaps should play in supporting a strong, sustainable and vibrant local media sector in the United States. My name is Damien Radcliffe and I'm the Carolyn S. Chambers Professor of Journalism at the University of Oregon and a Knight News Innovation Fellow at the Tau Center for Digital Journalism, which is hosting this series of events. Last month, our expert panel dived into media policy in the United States, giving us a fantastic overview of the key issues, challenges, and opportunities that we see in this space. And this month, we're going to look a little further afield at lessons that we can learn from media policy in other markets. One of the key reasons why I'm really keen to dive into this topic is because I feel as if the policy conversation in the States often feels rather myopic and slightly enclosed, often not looking at what's happening in other markets around the world, even though many of the same structural challenges that are faced by local journalism, and of course its importance to communities and the wider media ecosystem, are universal. So because of that, today we're going to dive into an exploration of some of the things that are happening in Europe and in Australia in the local media policy space. And to help us dive into this topic, I'm delighted that we're joined by 3 globally recognized experts in this field. Dr. Christie Hess is an Associate Professor of Communication at Deakin University in Australia. Her research focuses on the relationship between journalism, placemaking, and social order, especially in local and digital settings. Christie is an Associate Editor of the journal Digital Journalism and is currently a Chief Investigator on 2 projects funded by the Australian Research Council. Dr. Matthew Powers is an Associate Professor at the Department of Communication at the University of Washington, where he's also the Co-Director of the Center for Journalism, Media and Democracy. Matthew's research explores transformations in contemporary journalism through a cross-national comparative lens, and he's been engaged for many years in comparative analysis of journalism in France and the United States. And Samir Padania is the Director of Macroscope, an alumnus of the Open Society. He works with journalists, funders, investors, researchers, and others on a range of innovation funding and policy initiatives with a focus on growing public interest journalism and information ecosystems. Earlier this year, he led the Forum on Information and Democracy's global report calling for a new deal for journalism, and his other recent work includes a guide to funding journalism and media, and he also writes the Journalism Funders Forum newsletter on how public interest journalism is funded across Europe. If you're not signed up to that newsletter, we'll post the link in the chat so that you can remedy that as soon as possible. Okay, we have lots of interesting things to dive into with our expert panel today. We're also really keen to hear from you and to field as many questions as we possibly can. So please feel free to use the Q&A function or the chat function for any questions that you might have. Nick Matthews, who's my fantastic research assistant on this project, will be fielding those questions and we'll ensure that we get to as many of those as we possibly can. To get the ball rolling, though, because we're looking at potentially some very, very different markets, both different from the US and indeed from each other, I'm going to ask each of the panelists to give us a short overview of some of the key media policy issues that are currently being discussed in their geographic areas of expertise, looking at some of the issues that are on the table and are being discussed, and some of the solutions that are also part of public discourse right now. Christie, shall we start with you? What's the current conversation looking like in Australia?
I'm on mute. Thanks, Damien. Yeah, sure. Here in Australia, we've had several recent government inquiries, one of which is actually still ongoing into issues of media diversity, given the intense concentration of ownership here. I would say probably the biggest intervention has been the mandatory bargaining code, which I'm happy to perhaps talk about in a moment. But we've also had the introduction of government subsidies for local news, and that money started flowing back in about 2018. And when I say flowing, I probably mean it came about in dribbles and spurts. So firstly, we had grants for small regional publishers to help fund short-term cadetships, digital upskilling like drones, software, website development. There was an expectation with those grants that local newspapers actually knew how to write a government grant application. And so many actually missed out on that opportunity because it was just too hard. So that pot of money was folded into two bigger schemes with a funding pool of about 50 million. And this time it was opened up to bigger conglomerates like News Limited, which is Murdoch. But news startups that were looking to fill news gaps, they just weren't eligible for that money. And there's not actually a public register that has a list of who these grants are going to and how they're being spent. So we've had the instance of Win Television, a broadcaster here that was allocated 4.5 million to boost journalism, and they actually shut down local news services within 6 months of receiving that money, centralising them to metropolitan centres. There's been a lot of talk of taxation levers, so using research and development credits to support new startups. And I guess on the issue of tax, there's talk of digital news subscriptions and donations, making them tax deductible. There's also, they actually have introduced a commercial broadcasting rebate for transmission licenses to help the broadcast sector. But look, I guess the big problem that we have here in Australia is the issue of ongoing structural reform rather than these one-off types of band-aid measures that I'm sure is a problem for the other panelists. So that's the situation in Australia, Damien.
Great. Thank you, Christie. That's a fantastic overview and really interesting to see that some of these initiatives were taking place pre-COVID, because I think a lot of our attention is probably focused on the response to the challenges that the sector is facing right now and has done over the course of the last 18 months. But of course, as we know, these problems are much more systemic than that. And many interesting things there that I'm sure we'll dive into further around things like transparency and indeed who receives this kind of support. Matthew, would you like to give us a little bit of an overview from your perspective, please?
Sure, and thanks, Damien, and thanks to the Tau Center for organizing this wonderful event. In one way, the basic issue in Europe is really, really similar to the basic issue in the United States. And it's just that the debate about how to deal with it and the ways to deal with it is very different. But in another way, a core problem faced in Europe is very, very different. And so I thought what I would do is I'd try and just briefly talk about each of them in turn. So as in the US, the basic problem in Europe and Western Europe in particular is that the historically largest providers of local journalism, which is to say print newspapers, are on very shaky financial footing. Of course, it varies by country. Of course, it varies by publication and outlet and stuff. But it's the same story everywhere. The business model isn't working. The audiences are aging, the future is online, and it's uncertain in terms of what it's going to look like. That, in fact, you could sort of drop into any newsroom or any journalism association anywhere and find roughly that same set of conditions. What's different is that the core debate in many European countries tends to be less about whether aid should be provided, but instead it really revolves around who should get support and what form that support should take. And so, for instance, the questions that arise are, should aid be directed primarily towards local newspapers that historically have offered the majority of local news? Or does doing that risk propping up some organizations and some companies that not only are failing economically, but have also done relatively little to adapt? And so there sort of a problem with that. Should aid also go to new entrants, like for instance, people who develop online only, startups and websites? And if so, given the very, very low entry costs into that, what are the mechanisms that should be used to decide who it is that receives support from the state? And so those are some questions about who. And the questions also arise regarding what type of form the aid should take. So there's been a whole range of different ways in which the form has taken. For instance, sometimes news organizations are given aid directly. This is something that's happened, for instance, in France. It happened with the so-called help plan in the aftermath of the 2008-2009 crisis, where literally money was just given to existing news organizations. Other ways in which it sometimes worked is to give qualifying news organizations preferential tax rates. So taxing news organizations at far lower and sometimes almost no tax rate in exchange for some public service commitments and some public interest obligations. And sometimes it also takes the forms of funds being set up to support innovative works of journalism that the market is unlikely to or hasn't shown any interest in supporting. And so All of these have been tried to varying degrees in different parts of Western Europe. And with respect to it, I would start just by saying, I don't think any of them is a sort of single magic bullet. My sense is that the aid that's worked is that which generally tends to be organizationally agnostic, so is not necessarily favoring incumbents, but also doesn't have some blind belief in, future journalism organizations, and that finds ways to incentivize public service journalism, because I think that's the thing that's most important in general, but particularly at the local level. The second big media policy issue really pertains to public service providers. And this is a very, very different context from what you have in the United States. In a lot of ways, Western European public service providers are to varying degrees victims of their own historical successes. They are much better funded and serve much larger audiences than their American counterparts. They often are key local news providers in the different communities which they serve. When I initially started doing research with Rodney Benson on this over 10 years ago, one of the things that was really kind of shocking is just how little the United States actually puts forward on a per capita basis for public service media in comparison to its Western European counterparts. Now, what that means is that really nowadays the question is about how to promote journalistic excellence while adapting public service providers to the digital world. And this, of course, requires money. And a sort of common theme, I'm sure Samir will talk about this with respect to the UK, is that public funding has generally not kept pace with the needs that public service providers have. And this has led many to sort of seek other ways of raising money, either through advertising or merchandising. And this has met criticism from commercial counterparts who, I think not entirely unfairly, see it as unfair state-sponsored competition. And so for public service providers in Europe, the question is not the same as we find in the US. Instead, it's really how to ensure professional excellence that in many countries has long existed, of course, with any of the problems that you have in any longstanding bureaucratic news organization, but while making sure that it adapts and is civically accountable in a digital context.
Great, thank you, Matthew. That's a fantastic overview of some of the range of different challenges. You said there, both who is supported in what form, the variety of those different forms, and also, of course, the different context in terms of the way in which local journalism is supported and funded in the US versus some parts of Europe. And of course, public media also, public service media is a very important part of the Australian media ecosystem too, and I'm sure Christie will say plenty about that. Samir, over to you. What further things can we add to the conversation that's happening in Europe, which of course is a very large place with a lot of different markets and different areas?
I was going to say, I mean, when we were preparing, you said, well, talk from your region. And I said, well, which 40 countries would you like me to start with? Yeah. So I think, what I'll do is I'll just add a couple of things, I think, from the perspective that I've been working, which is really over the last year or two, particularly looking at the systemic threats that are in the sort of media policy sphere. And I'll sort of pick out just one, I think, which is particularly, one that Matthew talked about, and then one that's in Central and Eastern Europe particularly. And then I'll talk a little bit about the UK as a sort of microcosm of a lot of the things we talked about. So the public service broadcasters thing I'll come to, but I think that's part of this trend in Central and Eastern Europe, particularly of media capture. And over the last, maybe 10 years, there's been, people that I talk to, researchers I talk to, people like Maria Stragomir at the Central European University and others who track issues of media capture. This is where the state or its cronies or the government cronies, businesses, investors that are allied to the state will take over media businesses. There'll be regulatory capture. So, there are appointments get made by governments of the regulator or in the judiciary or whatever it might be. The erosion and assault on independence is happening and is very, very real. It's most acute in Hungary and Poland. And there are very few policy levers really in terms of media policy. One of the things that analysts in that region have sort of told me is that actually, funders 10 years ago stopped investing in media policy. as much as they had done before. You know, the 2010, the sort of early parts of the century had been really a rich period of doing lots of policy analysis, lots of comparative work, looking at the process of digitalization, how should laws change, and that sort of thing. That really tailed off outside of very particular slices. And that's left the sort of policy argument to others. And it's partly an asymmetric issue. You know, they have, you know, as governments have come in and been taking more and more power, acting in more and more authoritarian ways, it's harder and harder to catch up and to counter that. So that's a sort of general trend across, you know, many countries in that region to a greater or lesser extent. What is worrying to me, and sorry, that also involves things like taking over the public service broadcaster, you know, so there's political appointments. And you know, it means that something that should really be there for all citizens is actually there as a mouthpiece of the government, as an instrument of state. And that is really where you can see the misuse and the misappropriation of public funds and public policy in the service of, you know, authoritarianism, really. What's worrying to me from a policy perspective in Europe is that this is creeping across the rest of the continent in small ways, and in, you know, targeted ways, but there are things like that happening. So if you look at the UK from a distance from the US, for example, you think, you know, what's the problem? You've got the BBC, you've got the Economist, the Guardian, the Times, you know, it's a rich and varied and powerful media sector. You've got globally relevant media doing things that are influential. Journalists are up talking all the time. You know, it's a sort of terrific picture from afar. But actually, it's, you know, if you do the sort of powers of 10 thing and you go in to the, you know, next layer, things start to unfold and it looks a little bit less healthy. BBC is under attack. It's there are some analyses that show that in real terms, its budget has declined by, I think, in the region of 20 to 25% over the last decade. You know, it's coming up to a funding settlement during which the government is attempting to put in what is essentially a political appointee as the head of the regulator, Ofcom. There are people who are far more friendly and talking sort of in friendlier or more, you know, I don't want to say obedient, but more compliant or, you know, whatever the word is, ways to power to the government. And there's a real sense in which, you know, the government has a whip hand over the BBC and in deciding what its future funding and its future basis will be. Channel 4, which is a public broadcaster but is funded entirely from advertising, and for which there is no societal interest in privatizing it, is being privatized almost certainly. So there are all these bits in the public in infrastructure that are being sort of, for mysterious reasons, eroded, or for, you know, there's no, even though the policy discussion is entirely counter to that, the actual decision-making goes counter to the policy and all consensus, really. And I think that that's also true when you look at other layers. You look at, you know, for example, you know, I know that you've talked, in the last edition, you talked a lot about local journalism and about things like the Local Journalism Sustainability Act and measures that are coming in to try and infuse that sector, which has really suffered and really been eroded and hollowed out in the US, as everywhere else, infuse that with money. And to find structural ways to do that, long-term ways to do that. What we don't have, you know, there is, you know, there are moves to do it. There was a review by Dame Frances Cairncross, which 2-3 years ago, which pulled this out and came up with very practicable policy solutions, really obvious and not very expensive things. And very little of that was done. You know, innovation, an innovation fund, an Institute for Public Interest News. The Institute for Public Interest News was nixed. The innovation fund on which I worked, instead of being a 4-year, 10 million per year fund, was a 2 million 6-month fund, and before it was cut. So, you know, things like that. There's sort of very little infusion of policy, even under Corona, very little given to the independent and local sector. So, you know, in terms of actual policy, what, you know, there are sort of moves, like in Scotland, there was a working group on public interest journalism, which just yesterday published its report, which came out with some very, you know, again, very sensible, not very expensive measures. And it remains to be seen whether the Scottish government will do that and whether other parts of the UK, Northern Ireland, Wales and England will follow. But I think that's the big thing, that I think there's no lack of thinking, there's no lack of journalism, there's no lack of the independent sector in a way. What there is a lack of is resources and actual policy decision-making and policy willingness.
That's really interesting. And it's also really interesting you're saying that so many of these proposals, they're not necessarily that radical. They're often quite sensible, small steps, logical steps from where we are right now. And I'm curious as to whether the lack of desire to implement this and the lack of political will is in part also generated by a desire to see other parties perhaps pay for this, of which the platforms are the most obvious potential culprits. Christie, Australia and its relationship with Google attracted a lot of headlines here in the US and indeed around the world earlier this year. Could you give us a kind of quick update of where that relationship is at and how that dynamic is potentially being used to support local journalism? I think I'm right in saying you were quite critical of the proposed approach.
Look, I should definitely say from the outset that, look, asking Google and Facebook to help pay for news that's circulated on their platforms is definitely a necessary intervention, and it's actually been welcomed by a lot of news media enterprises on principle. But what the government is really intending to do here is let the market sort out the issue of news sustainability. And so it's really difficult, again, to get a handle on the extent and size of the deals that are taking place because of commercial incompetence. So from what I'm told, Google has been much easier to deal with than Facebook in these negotiations. But I guess in terms of my concerns and others, it's not just me, I think the mandatory code does two things. Firstly, it absolutely favours the big media players like News Limited. And that is not really addressing issues of media diversity. So smaller independent players, they're sort of pulling together to try and have collective bargaining power. But again, we've got the small startups, the people that are one man or one woman operators out there, and they can't get access to any of this funding. And ultimately, again, we have a lack of accountability. So I do think a shining exemplar in all of this is perhaps the role of our public broadcaster, the ABC, because it has negotiated a deal with Google and likely to do so with Facebook in the coming weeks. And what they're going to do is use the money to do a deep dive into the needs of local communities and plan out how to spend this money most effectively. So I think if the money is on the table, that's probably the exemplar of how it should be used. And the other thing I would say is that we've just conducted a big national survey of local news audiences. And what's really interesting is the continued demand for the printed product. So there's this shift into digital, and we've got Google teaming up with News Limited, for example, to upskill journalists in the digital terrain. But that's their playing space, and it's not helpful to the issue of print. When it is popular, particularly in areas where digital diversity is still a big problem. There's lots of areas where internet access is poor in Australia, as I know is the same case in the US. So that's where things are at with the mandatory bargaining code. It's a positive development on one hand, but still a long way to go.
Thank you. That's very helpful to understand. And I think we're going to talk more about the challenges for sort of new entrants and startups and the larger, this kind of smaller players and the difficulty of them both having a voice at the table, but also potentially being eligible for grants here. And Christie, right at the start, you said actually also there's a challenge there of just knowing, like, understanding the process, like how you apply for grants, having the resources to do that, and even understanding the language that's required in that space. Matt and Samir, could you say a little bit about the relationship with platforms? I mean, Matt, it's really interesting that just in the last 24 hours, we've had the development come out of France with a relationship between Google and AFP. I'm really curious if you could just briefly summarize that, but also whether you think that creates a precedent for relationships with other publishers that might follow a similar route.
So I'll just say quickly, maybe to give a little bit of context to it, I think in Western Europe in particular, the issue with platforms has kind of been dealt with in a couple of different ways. I think probably the first way, or initially the way governments sought to deal with it, was to strike deals between platforms and publishers. And so in 2013, France negotiated a one-time payment, or what was conceived at the time as a one-time payment of 60 million euros from Google. And that's obviously a lot of money. There were questions about who it went to and what it did, but it in no way solved the underlying problem, which was about compensation for the use of news articles by platforms. And so for this reason, what many countries have done is they've gone about trying to reform their copyright laws to find ways to make platforms pay for news snippets that they serve to readers. Spain and Germany did this in 2014, but more recently it's been done at the EU level itself in 2019 through something called its digital copyright directives. And France, in fact, used this in 2020 to launch a lawsuit against Google, which is effectively charging about $600 million to Google for violation of these copyright. Now, the aim in all of this, and this connects with what Christie's saying, is to get Google to negotiate license agreements with publishers. And the most recent news with AFP is one example of that. So AFP, at least according to the news that I read this morning, negotiated its own 5-year agreement with Google as a licensing agreement. The problem is that not all the publishers are united. And these agreements tend to go first to the largest and most established ones. And so there's really these questions about who gets included, who gets excluded, and is the basic point here one in which the very large platforms get into negotiations and licensing agreements with the largest, most established news organizations and news providers.
Thank you. That's helpful to understand. And I think, Samir, you also have other concerns, not just around who has that relationship with the platforms, but also about some of the rationale behind it. It's not necessarily benevolent acts of support for journalism, you could argue.
Yeah, I mean, I think following on from what both Christie and Matt have said, there is an active attempt within the UK to, there's a process where the government will be issuing a bill in the next 12 months, which relates to a similar sort of, its version of the bargaining code, or its version of that process. And so they've consulted around that. There's going to be stakeholder consultation. There's, and what I think has been different is that we've all watched that process, and, to some degree, there's been engagement with the regulator to say, okay, we watched that. Here are the dynamics here. Here are some of the things going on that are the way in which the platforms have operated in the UK, and how their interactions with journalism and how they're presented might skew the way in which you view, what outcomes you should be solving for, if you like, with legislation. I think they're alive to that. And they're alive to these issues of yes, not just dealing with the major incumbents, not allowing people to strike sweetheart deals, those sorts of things. And particularly, I think, what they ought to be hearing, hopefully, and have heard from, me and many others, is that actually it's that layer that I talked about before, the independent sector, which is in a sense economically almost separate from the mainstream, say 70%, 80% of the sector. There's a sort of part of the sector which is entirely separate and distinct, but is a critical part of the information structure and meeting information needs of communities across the country, that has no access to money, has no lobbying power, hasn't been engaged as with a collective voice and a collective sense of, okay, you matter, and part of this solution is that you also are part of the information ecosystem and, need to have part of the settlement. So I think that is something that is people appreciate much more, and I think that process is ongoing. I think the interesting thing is that, one of the other things I work on a lot is philanthropy. Nick kindly shared you mentioned the Journalism Funders Forum. That's about how funders and investors engage with journalism across Europe. In the UK, actually, there's very little media philanthropy, very little. And it's difficult even to tell whether it's growing or not. But the most important sort of funding for media that there has been over the last few years is from Google and Facebook. I actually worked as an independent assessor on one of the rounds of the Google Digital News Initiative's Innovation Fund. And I think in the region of 10 million euros went to the UK, which actually is probably the largest amount of funding that's gone into journalism in the UK over a 3-year period from anyone. So if you've got an organization like that, putting money in, actually doing interesting and sort of progressive things with it, you'd think that's a good thing. However, what we're seeing, I think, is a shift. And I think this is probably true of Facebook to some degree as well, but they're much more opaque in telling us about, who they fund and how much and all of that, is that their funding has shifted more from this kind of cash value to news organizations to do things and to produce products and, introduce product thinking and sort of advance their own agenda. And it's rebalanced towards products that are part of their ecosystem. So, they will be developing products that are supportive of the journalism ecosystem, and there's nothing wrong with that. But one of the worries, I think, is that they're increasingly tying their support for news organizations into that loop. So it's less and less giving them money, and it's more and more, saying we'll support you in an infrastructural sense. And I think that brings in a whole different set of policy questions. And I'm imagining that that's also happening, faster or slower in other regions.
I guess also alongside that, we must also be alive to concerns around independence, not just independence in terms of like products and tools, but also, well, what does this mean if you're getting financial support or in-kind support, be that from a government or from platforms? So Matthew Raffat asked a question about that right at the start, around the likelihood that journalists funded by the government would be able to criticize government operations. And I wonder if we could also level the same accusation and concern towards the platforms, that if you are dependent upon Google or Facebook for sustainability of your business, is there a risk that might preclude some of your journalistic independence? And how do we try to ensure that independence remains enshrined in the work that journalists do? I'll open up that enormous question to each of you, but and please feel free to go in whatever order you want on that.
I mean, I can jump in, with an example, not from here where I am, but actually data that's just come out from Sembra Media, which has issued an update to its inflection point report, and they've looked at Latin America now, a little bit of Anglophone Africa and Southeast Asia, and they've looked at funding that's come from the platforms in that, and one of the things that I think they found in Latin America particularly was that actually, and they took a sample, so it's not a sort of fixed set, they didn't target. They took a sample of digital media in the 4 countries that they looked at. I think it's Argentina, Brazil, Colombia, and Mexico. And nearly all of them had received some money from the platforms, which if you'd looked maybe 5 years ago, 10 years ago, certainly would not have been the case. So I think I don't think there's any suggestion that compromises anyone's independence, but I think what it does is, as you say, it makes people have to think, okay, we now have to develop a policy on this. We now have to be clear about this, and we have to, when we enter into these relationships, and also the platforms themselves have to be much clearer on that front and be very, very clear that the funding that they provide, because it's not subject to the same sort of regulation and oversight and scrutiny that philanthropic money might be in a regulatory sense, it is corporate giving effectively. So it's not subject to the same sort of strictures or accountability. So I think for them, they need to find a way to do that, whether that's by hiving the money out into a separate and accountable structure, or being much more transparent about the policies and the ways and the agreements that they have around that. I think one of the other fears that people have is around intellectual property, for example, and the relationship between, it's one of the questions that comes up, intellectual property in the platforms. When you accept funding from the platforms, what's the intellectual property discussion there? So I think the lesson around those things is really start with transparency, start with very, very frank and open conversations, and don't be cowed.
Thank you, Samir. That's really helpful. Christie,
I would just
you have quite a bit to say, particularly about transparency, which you've already touched on during the course of this conversation, or lack thereof.
Yeah, I'll just be brief, I think, Damien, because I think that's a very important question. But if we look at the public broadcaster in Australia, the ABC, it is fiercely proud of its investigative reporting, and it really does have that independence, although it is accused of being incredibly left-wing, and it's in constant tension with the Murdoch press. But I think it is a great exemplar of what can happen in a country when you do have investment in public service media. I do want to touch on the issue of government advertising at some point, but maybe not quite now, because I think it's really Matt's space here to talk about that issue of transparency.
Sure, let's do that, and then let's come back to talking about government advertising, because that is certainly a big potential lever, and something that we've seen particularly in other markets around the world, particularly like Southeast Asia and Africa, for example. But Matt, let's come to you about this question around transparency and independence, and that, as we know, is a source of considerable concern in the US, and has historically been one of the reasons why people have been really wary of different forms of direct government support.
So I would think about it in terms of any type of funding, regardless of who it comes from, always brings opportunities, and it always brings constraints and potential threats. I was talking with someone yesterday who was talking about how much the Washington Post is doing and seems to have done since Jeff Bezos took over as the owner. And why couldn't we get more enlightened donors to come in? And then someone made the point that, if Jeff Bezos decided that he wanted to send another member of the Star Trek cast to space, rather than continue funding, there's nothing to stop him from doing it. And so I think the key point is that no matter what type of funding you're looking at, there's always constraints that are involved with it. With respect to public service broadcasters, particularly some of the better ones in Europe, there are sort of clear mechanisms that in research that I've done with Tim Neff and Rod Benson, typically finds that, public service broadcasters that are able to secure their funding over multi-year periods, that's very important. When they have legal charters that restrict partisan interference, that's very important. When there are oversight agencies with sort of arm's length independence from the government in power, that's very important. And when there are audience councils and surveys that sort of work as mechanisms to ensure that the public service broadcaster has links to its many different diverse publics and constituencies.
That's an excellent list of a variety of different methods that can be used to ensure and preserve that independence. Christie, you wanted to talk about government advertising. Do you want to say a little bit about that? Because I think that is a really important topic. We just need to unmute.
Sorry, I keep muting. And just in regards to the issue of stifling independence, I think we have to remember that we need to always go back into history to remember that in many countries like Australia and the US, it has been government advertising spend that has long been a dominant source of income for media. And that's not something that we turn too much attention to or critique, because it's a little bit uncomfortable. And I've referred to this elsewhere as a silent, unspoken type of subsidy. So there's always been government advertising revenue coming in, but that has not dramatically affected the role of independent journalism. It's just been on the other side of the fence coming in from the advertising department. I think it's a really important issue. There are examples in Australia of some local governments allocating these types of funds to certain outlets over others because they're concerned about aggressive coverage, or because they feel the money's better spent recruiting their own marketing team to produce a government newsletter. So I think that's a greater threat to independent journalism, and it's just a start of that conversation around advertising, Damien.
That's probably a whole other webinar to talk about advertising. But Samir, yes, please do come in.
Just very quickly on that. That is a phenomenon that we, in the Forum on Information and Democracy report that you mentioned, that I worked on earlier this year, it was one of the largest issues, and one of those, like you say, a lot of the measures are like they're sort of bureaucratic. They're a sort of do it or don't do it kind of thing. It's kind of and it is one of those things that in lots of markets, it's being misused because the potential in the structure allows it to be misused, and what was described to us, in India, Bangladesh, a few other places like that. There are, it wouldn't take a huge amount, and there are already policy proposals out there that would enable governments to take measures to actually, to make it transparent, to make it fair, to make the allocation much fairer across a much more contemporary of government advertising, and not use it as a tool of political control, to use it as a tool of censorship and those sorts of things, which is happening in lots and lots of societies. It's a form of soft censorship, but actually in some places it's happening because the policymakers don't know what to do and how to reform. So it's not that it's everywhere, is it a malign influence? Sometimes it's just sort of policy decay or something. I don't know if you want to call it that, but yeah.
Well, and it's also part of one of the things that Nikki Yasha talked about in our first webinar, which is the fact that there have always been a variety of soft subsidies and different ways in which journalism, including local journalism, has been supported. It's not just necessarily about some of the direct interventions that are perhaps most obviously on the table. I think one thing that's also really interesting is to see how, because we talked about the fact that so many of the issues that we are trying to tackle are global. This is why I think that actually looking at solutions that are in place in particular markets do have the potential to be adopted or adapted and remixed in different markets, and that therefore I hope we're all looking sort of beyond national borders for ideas and lessons learned. And Emily Bell has asked a question in the Q&A, using the Q&A function, very much related to this. So Emily asked, how much has the Australian News Media Bargaining Code had an impact, not just in Australia, but around the world? Be curious on your takes on that. And she says, I wonder if Samir's point about platform funding is tied to this, whether funding is part of a regulated framework. Is it better or worse than when it's tied to a patronage model? So there's a lot of stuff to unpack there. Matthew, I wondered maybe if we could come to you first on that, as to what extent you think we are seeing reverberations beyond Australia in terms of the bargaining code there. Is that something that you're seeing in your work?
So, I was actually going to defer to Christie at first to make sure that I understood all the specifics of the Australian case. I do think, broadly speaking, it's true that as one case reverberates globally, that people are adapting and learning different tools to be able to use. It's not a coincidence, I don't think, that France and Australia have actually gone after Google at roughly the same time, using roughly similar types of tools and measures. So I don't think that that's unheard of. I don't have any inside information, and I don't have any particular details about the extent to which there's a sort of conscious borrowing from policies and things that are going on in the Australian case.
But as you say, it is interesting that the timing and some of the approaches are very similar. Christie, should we come back to you then for a little bit more insight on Australia, and then we'll come back to the patronage point, which perhaps I can ask Samir to take.
Oh, look, I do think the Australian context will have global implications, and Facebook and Google are very aware of that. During the negotiations, they did everything in their power not to enact the code. So there was a blackout of all news services by Facebook at one point. It's not actually a bad thing in my view, because I do think that people can find news independently of Facebook, but again, that's probably a conversation for another day. So I do think it will have global implications, and that the giants are very aware of that.
And Samir, to this thorny question of patronage versus sort of regulated frameworks, what's your take on Emily's question there?
I don't know. I'd be interested in her take. It's Emily Bell. I don't know. I mean, when I go back to what we did with the Forum report, the New Deal, called for a New Deal for journalism, and it was really trying to say in every place there are these arrangements where there are sort of imbalances in the market. There are places where you have to come up with these arrangements that tie actors with power into structures where they have to participate, they have to play nice, they have to give up a portion of their power, they have to also, they have to be regulated in a way that then will force them to contribute to the ecosystem and not just take it on their own terms and shape it on their own terms. So, I think that there is a role for that. I think, in some places that's not what you would want to do. You wouldn't want to, the regulatory frameworks are not robust enough and sophisticated enough or integrated enough to support that kind of move. And so you might want to have other kinds of deals. But I think wherever the case may be, you need to look at questions of how they contribute to the ecosystem, to greater independence, to diversity of ownership and diversity of perspective and geography and all of that sort of stuff. Just very quickly on the international, rollout, if you like, or the ripples of Australia. When I sort of was tracking this 6 months ago, even 6 months ago, it was Japan processes. Governments and regulators had called processes of based on the news bargaining code. In Japan, Indonesia, South Korea, South Africa, and Turkey, and that was just literally weeks after it happening in Australia. So I think there's a definite wave of interest and of regulators being instructed to inspect this sort of interplay and work out what they could do.
Now, I'm conscious of time, and I know this is a very complex space. There are many of the issues that we've touched on. We could do entire hour-long discussions and then some on. But I do want to come back to this question around startups and new players in this ecosystem, because I think that's really important. That is an opportunity where funding and regulation can potentially support that. We've talked about some of the challenges. Some examples have already been highlighted of where restrictions on funding have potentially excluded digital-only players or players who are fairly kind of new and nascent, so startups haven't been around long enough to be eligible for funding. I wondered if each of you could just say a little bit about your experience in this space in terms of what you're seeing in terms of different levers that are being used to encourage diversity and new players, and what are some of the transferable lessons from that we could potentially try to encourage and facilitate in the US? Who would like to go first on that? Matt.
I'm happy to maybe just to get the ball rolling on it. So the place that I've studied, or the places that I've studied startups most specifically, are actually two relatively mid-sized cities in France and the US. And so you should take everything with a grain of salt, because those are very particular contexts. So you can't extrapolate them to make sort of general rules. But I think the important thing to keep in mind is that in those places, startups have largely been formed without any kind of direct governmental support. And oftentimes they've happened actually in part by sort of having to fight in order to get the same provisions that legacy news providers get. So the classic case in France was that for a long time, startups were actually not taxed at the preferential tax rate, which was the difference between getting a 2% tax rate versus a 20% tax rate. And there had to be, sort of long drawn out battles in order to win those protections. But actually, at least in the places that I've studied, particularly with respect to local news provision in France, the success of startups comes down really to the strength of the incumbents that already exist in the place and the spaces that the new entrants want to occupy in relation to them. What we've seen fairly clearly is that if a new entrant comes in and wants to do something that is not directly sort of a business threat to the incumbent will actually let it go. And so actually some of the most interesting and innovative stuff that's actually happened in southwestern France and Toulouse has nothing to do with online. It's like a slow journalism thing that's done in print in a magazine. And the reason they're able to get away with that is because the major incumbent news organization had gotten rid of all of its holdings in that area and decided it didn't actually want to play in that space. By contrast, you had these really sort of energetic people who, came out of journalism school, had a very Parisian idea of what it was that local journalism could be, and they tried to transpose that onto the, sort of local space in Toulouse. And they actually had a reasonable audience. It's just that they weren't actually able to secure advertising. They weren't actually able to be able to do the things to keep the business going. And oftentimes when they went and talked to people about sponsorships, what happened was that the advertisers would say, well, it's not that we don't want to support you, it's that, the main newspaper told us that if we support you, we can't advertise with them, and they're a bigger space. And so oftentimes it has to do really with, the strength of the incumbent. So what can the government do to support that? Well, I do think that one of the things that's been exciting in some of the Northern European countries is oftentimes there are these funds for individuals and organizations to be able to pursue either projects or to develop organizations that do something that the market is not currently willing to support. Now, this is not a panacea, it's not a cure-all, but it's one way of trying to create space for the types of journalism that we might think of as important, but that the market at present doesn't actually provide.
Thank you. So there's lots there in terms of creating a level playing field, looking at perhaps anti-competitive behavior, but also efforts that are specifically designed to address areas of market failure. Christie, please do come in on this.
Yes, I think the Australian government is particularly interested right now in leveraging research and development tax credits, which are currently designed for science and technology, not humanities and culture, and seeing that as the appropriate lever to help startups. But there just is this issue of unfair competition, and so I fully echo Matt's points and concerns. And I'll just give the example of a little town in Australia called Narracourt. And during COVID, the big media player ACM had a paper there and closed its doors, said, no, we can't serve the needs of the community. It's all too hard. So we had a businessman who had returned home to care for his mother who was ill. And he said, I can't have this. We have to have a newspaper. So he set one up. And within 12 months, he realised that he was not eligible for any grants because he didn't have a turnover of at least 150,000. Now, if you're in a rural area and you're a solo operator, if you can make a living, you're doing well. So the turnover parts of this were way out. I just think there are examples like this all over the world around this unfair playing field. And if we can't sort it out structurally, because in Narracourt, for example, not only was ACM able to open its paper again when it was eligible for subsidies, but it also was tapping immediately into the local government advertising, which the new startup wasn't getting. So big problem.
Right. And did that then also squeeze out the startup? What's the current status of that? Do you know?
It is still going, but it is difficult. He's moved to a different model. Like he's trying very hard to appeal to that sense of community. So he's moved more to a membership model, asking people just out of the goodness of their heart, really, to support that type of news. But I don't think we should have to do that.
Well, there's great news that it's still going, so that's really heartening to hear. Samir, from the startup perspective, what are the other things that are on your radar in terms of challenges and most importantly, potential solutions?
Yeah, I mean, there's one that I'm looking into at the moment. I know there's already a lot of work happening, both sort of on an industrial level, if you like, and also on an academic level in different parts of Europe on clusters, so media clusters, and this sort of cluster policy where you will have a group of businesses, whether it's in a city block or it's in a university campus or it's in a district of a city or a region. There's one in Bergen in Norway, there's one in Wales, which is going absolutely incredibly at the moment, doing really interesting work called Cluster. There are others dotted around the place. And I think that to me is a really interesting way for particularly subnational actors, mayors and states and regional authorities to put money into that kind of development, but alongside research money, alongside investors, alongside multiple sources of money, the examples I've looked at, I think what's interesting about them is that they do include journalism, and they increasingly include journalism and media, but they also tie it into a wider creative economy. And I think that that's one of the things that's really interesting, that to sort of, rather than keeping journalism very, very separate and, oh no, we must be pure and away from everyone else, actually there's a lot of foment and a lot of sort of cross-pollination and interesting things happening when, not least in things like audience practices, understanding how these other parts of the creative economy deal with audiences and how they build real value for their audiences and, grow them. There's a lot that journalism can learn and use. I think the other thing that I would pick out is the sort of non-profit and independent sector, which I think is increasingly decoupling. It was sort of lost and a little bit, didn't have an identity. Now I think there's a real sense in which in lots and lots of countries across Europe, including in the UK, you've got a real push to self-identify as an independent sector. And that includes cooperatives and non-profits and charitable status media and all sorts of other kinds of things, even media set up by NGOs, editorially independent units within NGOs. So I think I think that's another thing to keep an eye on, that as that coalesces and begins to attract funding, potentially, let's hope, we can start to approach the kind of money that's washing around in America.
Well, I don't know how I'd quite describe it as washing around, but there is some for sure, and certainly a greater willingness for that discussion. We have about 2 minutes left, so I'm just going to ask each of you to, in 30 seconds or potentially less, to say, well, what's the one idea or one thing that you have seen working that you would like us to explore and consider with regards to the market here in the US? Samir, do you want to start with that, and then we'll come to Matthew and end with Christie?
Definitely. So I think what's interesting is these, for example, Matt was talking about, state subsidies to media. There are in Denmark, for example, the qualifying media of a certain size and so on, they just get a payment. They get, related to their editorial investment and so on, and it's in law. And I think an expansion of that idea, doing that in the US as a sort of universal basic organizational income for qualifying organizations, and I leave it to you to decide who qualifies. But I think for those who are doing something that's public interest, information needs focused, it should just be an automatic transfer that just happens.
Excellent, great, thank you. And we have just this week seen sign into legislation a moves that trying to define who is potentially eligible for some of these types of support. Matthew, what's the one big thing you would like to see?
So of course, there are a bunch of things, but if I had to just pick one, I would say more per capita funding for public media. I do think that that's important. It's woefully underfunded relative to Western Europe and really to other parts of the world. It's clearly doable. We could have much better public media than we have now, and it could be much more broadly available. So if I could only pick one thing, that would be it.
I'm sorry to limit you to one, but public media is a good one. So, and Christie, over to you.
Well, I would agree with Matt, but that means I get another one. Right. I would just like to flag a state government in Australia that is taking a democratic responsibility model to its advertising and actually making sure that a strong percentage is being allocated to rural and regional providers, because it's just, fundamental to their survival.
Excellent. That's great. Well, thank you so much for all of your thoughts and expertise today, Christie, Matthew, and Samir. It's been wonderful to hear your perspectives, and I appreciate that we could have talked for hours about this, and we've crammed a lot into the last 60 minutes looking at some of the current debates in the media policy space and relationships with platforms, who gets support, questions around transparency and oversight. There's a lot of things to dive into here. So thank you so much for that great overview. Do keep an eye on our social channels and Tal's newsletter for details of our next panel, which will be on Thursday, the 16th of December at the same time, 4 p.m. Eastern Time, where we will be exploring grassroots media and in particular talking to experts in that space about how we can ensure that grassroots media both gets the support that it needs, but also has a voice and a place at the table as part of these discussions. So until then, thank you everybody for joining us today. And thanks again to our expert panel for all of their insights today.